Yes, good afternoon. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife YouTube. Hey, fall is in the air. Look at this leaf I picked off my lawn today. Bright red, crimson red. But you know what happens in the fall here in New Hampshire? It's deer hunting season. In fact, the New Hampshire archery deer hunting season started on Sunday, September 15th. You know, our deer herd has progressed dramatically in the 40 years that I have been involved with the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, starting out as a wildlife biologist in the late 70s. And it got me thinking about where the deer herd has come over many decades. Of course, I delved into my favorite book here, The History of New Hampshire Game and Fur Bearers by Helen Silver, to look for some historical perspective. But you know what? Last year, the archery deer hunters, and the season lasts actually 3 months. It starts September 15th and goes till December 15th. Last year, the archery deer hunters took 3,962 deer. Do you know that is more deer than were taken during the entire deer season in 1983, when only 3,280 deer were killed in the entire fall season in 1983. So this got me reflecting on how the deer herd has changed during my career at Fish and Game and over the last decade. In the early 1980s, the Fish and Game Department estimated there were about 40,000, maybe 43,000 deer in 1983. That was the first year that the Fish and Game Department had full authority to regulate deer hunting. Prior to that, the deer hunting season had been set by the legislators, as were most of the other trapping and hunting seasons across the state, and changed very little from year to year or even decade to decade. And if we look back even further in Helenette's book here, we see that in the 1700s, early 1700s, deer were quite plentiful across the state. But by the mid-1700s, so by 300 years ago, the deer herd was vastly diminished. And by 1800, it was felt that the deer were nearly gone, extirpated in New Hampshire. And that was to be the case for almost 100 years until the early 1900s. Now, according to this book, yes, the legislators passed some laws to protect deer in the 1800s, but the fact was there was no fishing game department. There was no way to enforce any of those laws. So people basically killed and ate everything they could to survive in the 17 and through the 1800s, including the deer. And so they wiped them out, basically. And the habitat was changed. By 1820, there were 1 million sheep in New Hampshire. So most of the stone walls we see scattered throughout the woods here in central and southern New Hampshire were sheep pastures. So there were 1 million sheep. Not many trees were left, not much cover for deer. So people were able to pretty much wipe them out because their habitat had been diminished. So not only did they hunt them year-round or kill them, and really not hunting, they just killed them for their survival and diminished the numbers, but the habitat was vastly depleted. But beginning there at 1900s, the deer herd began to come back, and I'm looking at here by the 1920s, the deer herd was starting to come back, and in 1922 by the 1922 was the first year there was mandatory reporting of any deer you killed. That year, 1,896 deer were reported. 1925, 1,493. So very, less than 2,000 deer. Most of these years, all through the 20s and 30s. By the mid-40s, early to mid-40s, the deer herd had bounced up a bit into the 5,000 range. 1943, 5,275 deer. Strikingly enough, by 1951, 11,853 deer were taken. Now, as I recall, just as I was beginning to hunt in the mid-60s, the deer season there was a split season for deer hunting in New Hampshire. You could hunt the month of December in the southern 7 counties, and November December was the southern 7 counties, and November was the northern 3 counties. So it was a split deer season, but it was 60 days long. So depending on where you lived, and a lot of people live near the line, and you could go and hunt for basically 2 months, and the deer herd was again pushed to the brink, I think, by the 60s into the 70s, and I know in the late 70s we had some difficult winters. I know when I started hunting in the mid 60s, there were still quite a few deer, although sometimes you go a year without seeing one. But the actual record deer kill happened in 1967, when 14,204 deer were killed in 1967. But if you look at what made up that record kill, almost half of them were females. So over a 10-year period, Fish and Game says that between 45 and 48% of the deer killed each year were females, does. So it wasn't until 1983 that the Fish and Game wildlife biologist could recommend a season and begin to actually create hunting zones. Now we have 20 wildlife management units scattered across the state, and so the deer herd is managed very differently today. We don't have deer permits, but we have any 6 deer days. So that's how New Hampshire has managed their deer herd the last 36 years. But I also see that the wildlife biologists from Fish and Game back in the 40s began collecting information on deer, on winter kills. I know when I first started, every spring there would be a big search in the northern deer yards for dead deer in the deer yards, and you examine the deer carcasses to see if they starved to death in winter or not. You actually can break open a leg bone in the deer and look at the fat in that, in the femur, the bigger leg bone, and determine whether the deer was in good health or not. Plus, the wildlife biologists across the state to this day still do winter deer yard searches. So when I worked for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department for 3 decades, part of my job each winter was to search out deer yards and examine to see if the deer were significantly impacting those yards, and that continues to today. So deer numbers are monitored by winter deer checks. There are biological check stations throughout the state. Again, wildlife biologists man these check stations. Men and women are at the deer check stations for their first couple of days of the muzzleloader season and the 3 days of the regular season. And last year, I think they examined 970 deer, something like that. So almost 1,000 deer were examined last year. We measure the antler beam diameter of the yearling bucks as an indicator of their health. If the antler beam diameter begins to shrink, you know that their deer are impacting their food, their forage, and perhaps in that particular wildlife management unit, you might add some doe days. Also, the deer are weighed, and so each year there are multiple ways to check on the condition of our deer and their habitat by wildlife biologists across New Hampshire, and that has been going on for over 4 decades. So what has happened to the deer population over the last 40 years that I've been involved? Well, in 2018, the deer kill was 14,113, so fewer than 100 less than the all-time record. But the big difference was there were 8,952 males or bucks killed and only 5,161 females. So 63% of the deer kill now is made up of bucks, and only 37% were does last year. And that means the deer herd, we have many more females left. In fact, in the 40 years that I've been involved with deer management or observing it, the deer population went from what I had mentioned in the 1980s of around 40 to 43,000 deer to now it is estimated over 120,000 deer right here in New Hampshire. So 3 times as many deer are on the ground here in New Hampshire. And the other big change that has happened is back in the 60s, the majority of the deer kill came from the northern 3 counties, where the deer were not as severely depressed by our ancestors, and some remained in the actual Coos County, the deer herd bounced back sooner than in southern New Hampshire. But now the majority of the deer kill comes from the southern counties, and in fact the seasons are much longer down here as well. So there are 20 wildlife management units, and 13 of the 20 wildlife management units, the deer population is estimated to be at or above what the public wants it to be. And how do we know that? Well, every 10 years the Fish and Game staff do a survey of hunters and non-hunters alike, and go out and ask them, do you want more, fewer, or the same number of deer, fewer or more, same number of bear and turkeys, and fan out across the state and do some surveys. And based on that, there is a plan, a 10-year plan that is adopted based on the deer densities that the population of humans support in each of these 20 wildlife management units, and the season, the number of days that female deer can be killed or antlerless deer can be killed are changed in each unit based on the impact on that deer population. And as I said, this has gone on since 1983, so we have 36 years of experience in manipulating those either 6 days to come up with the right balance of deer in each zone, and also so that's not impacting the habitat. In some cases, of course, the farmers. So there is an ongoing effort to very carefully manage our white-tailed deer, and we have way more than we have had since colonial times. So there are now more white-tailed deer in New Hampshire than they were in the late 1700s and all through the 1800s. So lots of deer in New Hampshire, and we are reaping the benefits. The deer kill has been 10,000 or above the last decade, compared to 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 in the 80s and into the early 90s. So deer are doing well. The habitat is being monitored. Wildlife biologists are out there year-round observing deer, observing the habitat. Another thing that's going on that I should mention is in the northern part of New Hampshire, where there are the big paper company lands or big landowners. There has been over the years one wildlife biologist that has worked with those big paper and paper land owners, paper company landowners, to work with them to protect and preserve the deer wintering areas, the deer yards. In northern New Hampshire, it's the spruce fir habitat. In central and southern New Hampshire, it's the hemlock stands that I would check when I was looking at winter deer yards here in southern New Hampshire, central New Hampshire, plus sometimes south-facing slopes. So there's always been, for over 40 years, efforts to protect deer wintering areas in New Hampshire by the Fish and Game Department, to work with landowners to protect and manage those deer wintering areas whenever possible, and to map them. And so a great deal of effort is undergone each year by Fish and Game staff, the wildlife biologists, to monitor the deer population, to monitor deer kill, to monitor the health of the deer. And because of that, we're killing 3,000 deer by archery, and another 10,000 or more during the muzzleloader and regular season. So yes, we have more deer in New Hampshire than they've been here since colonial times, and the deer season has started. There's no reason to think we're not going to have another near record deer kill in 2019. I bet there's going to be well over 10,000 deer taken this year in New Hampshire, and it's been great to be a part of managing the deer population right here in New Hampshire.